Mark Perry, for those who don't know, was the guy who came up with Sniffin Glue, a short-lived but important and influential punk rock fanzine. Sniffin Glue began in July of 1976, quite early on in the UK punk scene, and ran for about a year before calling it a day. Punk had very much begun to break through to the mainstream by this point, and Mark Perry felt that fanzines such as his no longer served a purpose. In the Sniffin Glue anthology, Mark is quoted as saying, "I don't write many letters to many magazines, but in the big issue recently, about 6 months ago, there was this article on bands with nowhere to play. It said about this government scheme to have local youth clubs having PA gear that people can use. And I wrote a letter saying rock music doesn't need that. It thrives with its back against the wall. We don't want government handouts. It's ridiculous." This is something I've been pondering on and off over the years. I remember Joss Whedon saying something similar about TV production, that restrictions are good because restrictions push creativity. I'm not so much looking to argue about whether we should or should not have a government. Let's just say so long as we have one, it should be acting in the best interests of the people, wherever possible. I'm more looking at the assertion that funding for small music venues would not be in the interests of the people. There is perhaps some merit to the argument. There's a number of bands I can think of who I personally think produced much better material when they were working on a smaller budget. For example, I remember enjoying the first Stereophonics album, but I couldn't help but notice more than a little hint of overproduction on their second effort. I made a prediction at the time that their third album would be bloated, self-indulgent nonsense that owed a lot more to production than it did to songwriting. And, yep. Having said that, Husker Du, a band known for their characteristic rawness, eventually signed to a major label and gave us 2 albums, Candy Apple Grey and Warehouse Songs and Stories, which both maintained a lot of that characteristic rawness of earlier releases. When I was in Sheldon, we recorded our first and only album using a Tascam 4-track Porter studio. This was partly down to restrictions of budget, but also because I'd always found recording in proper studios to be a bit hit and miss. Sometimes the engineer got it, sometimes they didn't. I was also a big fan of bands like Husker Du, the Jesus and Mary Chain, and Dinosaur Jr. at the time, and still am. I found that noisy, raw, unpretentious production style quite engaging and compelling. I should add, I also hated how alternative rock records sounded for the most part at that time, often featuring those annoying telephone backing vocals and layer upon layer upon layer of pointless overdubs. Reactions were mixed. Some people found our raw and unpretentious approach quite refreshing, others not so much. So I guess the question all this brings up is, was Mark Perry right? I don't think it's really a yes or no question, but it's an interesting topic for discussion in my opinion. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.